The odds that a mother would hide her own child in a crawl space in the wall sit somewhere between very little to no chance, but it turns out that these odds aren't as little as one would think. Richard Chekevdia, tagged "Boy Behind the Wall," may have been too little to understand the full extent of the trauma he passed through at the hands of his mother, but the world would never forget the heartbreaking incident. In this video, I will be sharing with you all the details about a little boy who was isolated from the world by his own mother and why she chose to treat him that way. Hiding Ricky under everyone's nose. In the year 2009, a 30-year-old woman identified as Shannon Wilfong was arrested and charged with the abduction of her own son. To properly understand the unbelievable extent of Wilfong's actions and her motivation, I would have to take you back to the very beginning. In 2007, Shannon and her boyfriend Mike Chekevdia were facing a rough patch in their relationship, and when the two began to consider going their separate ways, a battle for the custody of their son, Ricky Chekevdia, broke out. Eventually, in November of that year, Mike won temporary custody of Ricky. At the time, he probably thought that since the battle had been won, nothing could come between him and his son, but he couldn't have been farther from the truth. Shortly after Mike was awarded custody, Shannon and 4-year-old Richard disappeared into thin air. The day of the disappearance in November 2007 turned out to be the last time Mike Chekevdia saw his son until 2 years later, when police busted into a house and found both Shannon and Ricky. Things took an even more twisted turn when the hideout house turned out to belong to Richard's 51-year-old grandmother, Diane Dobbs. For the longest time, Mr. Chekevdia suspected that Diane was hiding Shannon and Richard in her house, but he couldn't get any evidence to back up his suspicions. Mr. Chekevdia was formerly a police officer who left the force to become a lieutenant colonel in the Illinois National Guard, so his suspicions about Diane's hand in his son's abduction were not based on mere emotions. These suspicions grew significantly when, all of a sudden, Dobbs started covering the windows around the house with drawn shades or other materials to prevent anyone from peeking in. While Mr. Chekevdia still didn't have any evidence to back up his suspicion, he now had reason to look into the situation. He somehow managed to get Dobbs to agree to him searching her house. Sadly, the search was fruitless, as the house showed no signs of harboring a little boy. After 2 long years of hopeless searching, the police received a tip which led them to Diana Dobbs' home, and this time, they didn't return empty-handed. Very little is known about where the tip came from, but the facts show that the authorities arrived at Dobbs' house with a search warrant. After inspecting and searching the property thoroughly, they found Ricky and his mother huddled in what appeared to be a secret crawl space in the wall. The space measured just around 5 feet by 12 feet, approximately the height of a washing machine. Further investigation of the house showed that there were other secret hiding places, including holes in the floor and in the wall covered up by a dresser. Dobbs must have been determined to help her daughter so much so that she agreed to have her house modified enough to keep them hidden in plain sight. However, as the saying goes, nothing is hidden under the sun, and luckily for Richard, he was found 2 years after he was abducted. Before being found, the little boy had spent 2 of his formative years living in tiny spaces and hadn't seen the sun in that time. For someone who had been isolated for years, Richard seemed to be in pretty high spirits. According to the police, when he was let out of the patrol car, he started to run around happily. He was also surprisingly social and chatty, as well as polite. Thankfully, Richard was forced to endure this sad fate for only 2 years before being rescued. It's safe to say that having to endure even a minute in such conditions is beyond inhumane. However, when compared to other children like Elizabeth Fritzl and the Sheffield girls who were also victims of their own parents, some people would consider Richard lucky. The Fritzl case came to light in 2008, but had lasted for over 2 decades. In April that year, a man, identified as Josef Fritzl, was arrested for the abduction of his daughter Elizabeth, whom he had kept locked up for 24 years. Elizabeth was just 11 years old when she first began to suffer sexual abuse at the hands of her father. After completing compulsory education, she tried her best to escape her father's evil by running away, but she soon wound up back home. Unknown to her, the worst was yet to come. In August 1984, shortly after she turned 18, Joselle lured Elizabeth down to the basement of the family home, claiming that he needed help with the renovations he had been carrying out. For months, Joselle had been digging up sand from the basement and working tirelessly to convert it into a makeshift prison, but no one knew his plans for the renovation. Without thinking too much of her father's request, Elizabeth helped Joselle carry the door he intended to install down to the basement. Unknown to her, this was the last piece needed to make the basement the perfect prison. Immediately the door was put in place. Fritzl covered Elizabeth's face with a towel soaked in ether and held it in place until she became unconscious. From that day, Elizabeth was held captive by her own father and was not allowed to see the sun for the next 24 years of her life. Josel's plan was to keep Elizabeth locked up in a location within his reach so he could take advantage of her for his own perverted gratification, and everything was going swimmingly. Few days after her disappearance, Elizabeth's mother, Rosemarie alerted the police. Fritzl immediately jumped on the situation by forcing Elizabeth to write a letter in which she stated that she was tired of living with her family and warned them not to try and find her. Fritzl informed the police that his daughter had likely joined a cult, which is why she left home. The police, members of the Fritzl family, and even the neighbors believed this elaborate lie, and so no one had an idea that Fritzl was hiding his daughter under everyone's nose, including his wife, much like how Shannon managed to hide Ricky under everyone's noses, ensuring that even when his father Michael had his suspicions, he had no evidence. For the next 24 years, Elizabeth went through hell at the hands of her father. Her living conditions were terrible as the basement was cold and damp and had no heating system, but that was the least of her problems. She had to put up with her father, who would come into the basement daily or at least 3 times a week to abuse her. Josef Fritzl ended up having 7 children with his daughter, Elizabeth. 3 of the children stayed with her in the basement, while Fritzl took 3 other children up to be part of the family. The children who were taken up all showed up mysteriously at the Fritzl's doorstep after being sent by their runaway daughter, who wasn't financially stable enough to raise children. Josef and his wife Rosemarie accepted the children and raised them as their own. One of the 7 children died 3 days after he was born. The end of the hellish treatment Elizabeth suffered at the hands of her father came to an end in 2008 when her 19-year-old daughter, who was one of the underground children, fell ill and needed to see a doctor. The doctors who were in charge of the case noted how pale the girl looked and asked Fritzl to bring her mother in. After lots of pleas from Elizabeth, Fritzl finally agreed to take her to the hospital to see her daughter. When Elizabeth made an appearance, the authorities were immediately alerted. She was interrogated by the police, but she only agreed to talk after she was assured that she would never see her father's face again. Elizabeth's detailed confession led to the arrest of 73-year-old Josef Fritzl in April 2008. And of course, like Shannon, Fritzl had what he thought to be a genuine reason for abducting his daughter. In the beginning of his trial, Fritzl claimed he imprisoned his daughter because she was a wayward child. He claimed he locked her up to protect her from bad friends, drugs, and drinking. The Fritzl case is often compared to the Sheffield incest case, in which a British man continuously raped his 2 daughters for a total of 25 years. In order to protect the victims' images, the British authorities decided to keep the family's name hidden and judge the case anonymously. However, the evil father is often referred to as the Gaffer, Mr. X, or the British Fritzl. The evil and incestuous father began raping his daughters when they were just 8 and 10 years old, respectively. Things simply got worse for the 2 young girls when their mother, who was also being abused, filed for a divorce and fled for her life. Unfortunately, fleeing for her life meant that her 2 young daughters were left alone to face the full extent of their father's depraved desires. Despite being young, the girls were wary of their father, and so he made a habit of threatening and beating them into accepting his behavior and submitting to his desires. If you're wondering how Mr. X was able to keep his wickedness a secret, here's how. He kept on moving his family from one remote location to another. Each new location was a place where no one could recognize them. The British Fritzl ended up producing 7 children with his daughters, but there were about 19 pregnancies in total. Some of them were purposely terminated, others were miscarried, and some children died. When the case was uncovered, the family doctor who helped deliver the babies was suspended from practicing medicine because they failed to report the abuse. At first, Mr. X did his best to deny the allegations, but DNA tests proved that the 7 children were his. It is believed that he decided to have children with his daughters so that he could pocket the money given to him by the government for child support. In the Sheffield case, the perpetrator found a means of keeping his victims hidden that was quite different from the method Ricky's method employed, but the truth remains that both parents put their children through unfathomable trauma. Although Ricky didn't experience the type of abuse that the girls did, it doesn't negate the fact that his mother locked him up for 2 years, and the reason behind her inconsiderate actions is something that is quite common among parents who abduct and maltreat their children. Dreadful divorce. Richard Chekevdia was too little to have committed any crime against his mother that could have warranted her decision to lock him up. Notwithstanding, Shannon was willing to go to extreme measures, just so she could hide her son and keep him hidden for as long as possible. But why? Most cases of parents abducting their children usually stem from divorce or separation, and that was the case for little Chekevdia. Shortly before his life would take a sad turn, his mom and dad broke up. Although they were never married, Shannon and Michael Chekevdia were going through a separation, which led to a custody battle. During the fight for custody, Shannon alleged that Mike assaulted Richard, most likely in an attempt to tip the odds in her favor, but after investigations didn't prove anything, Mike got custody. Since her original plan to paint her husband in a bad light failed, Shannon decided that keeping her son hidden from the world would save him from his father. According to Shannon's mother, Diane Dobbs, her daughter was pushed to hide Ricky because her ex-boyfriend, Mr. Chekevdia, had allegedly sexually assaulted the boy when he was younger. Till the time she was caught, Shannon believed that her actions actions were right because she was trying to protect her son from Mike, who she claimed was a child molester. Whatever the case, her actions affected the little boy in several ways. She claimed to have homeschooled him during the time he was locked up, but she neglected the importance of socialization. For the duration of time he was locked up, Richard did not receive any form of medical care except the medication his mother administered to him at home. Separation is often a common reason why parents resort to kidnapping their children. Sometimes the thought of separation, whether it be between the parents or between the parent and child, somehow triggers people to act drastically. In Shannon's case, she was not only separating from her boyfriend, but she had also lost custody of her little boy. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, most child abduction cases are planned and executed by parents or family members. Data gathered by the center shows that only 1% of missing children are abducted by strangers or non-family members. An example of another parent who couldn't handle being separated from her child can be seen in the case of Aranza Lopez, a little girl who went missing in 2018. 4-year-old Aranza Maria Ochoa Lopez had been separated from her mother and placed in foster care a year before her disappearance. The separation was initiated following complaints that Aranza was physically abused by her mother, Esmeralda Lopez Lopez. Esmeralda was only permitted to see her daughter twice a week during supervised visits, but she couldn't handle the separation, so she carefully devised a plan to change the situation. In October 2018, Esmeralda was on one of those supervised visits to a mall in Vancouver, Washington, when she asked for permission to take her daughter to the mall's restroom. What started out as a restroom break turned into a case of abduction that lasted for years. Esmeralda managed to abduct her daughter Aranza from the restroom and fled in a stolen vehicle. The search for Aranza lasted for about 4 years, even though Esmeralda was arrested in Pueblo, Mexico in September 2019. Finding Esmeralda did nothing to help the search for her daughter, probably because she was not willing to give up information about the child's whereabouts. The FBI had offered a $10,000 reward for information that would help find the girl. They also took things a step further by collaborating with the Vancouver police in Washington and law enforcement in Mexico in the search for Aranza. After 4 years, Mexican authorities found 8-year-old Aranza in Michoacan, Mexico. She was then brought back to the United States by FBI special agents. After her arrest in 2019, Esmeralda finally pleaded guilty in 2021 to second-degree kidnapping and robbery and first-degree custodial interference. She was then sentenced to 20 months in prison. In another case similar to the Chekevdia case, Julian Hernandez was abducted by his father when he was just 5 years old. In this case, the father was instigated to kidnap his son due to fear of separation from the child. Julian was reported missing in August 2002 after his father, Bobby Hernandez, had visited the boy's mother's home under the guise of babysitting. Bobby was not married to the boy's mother, but they had been in a relationship that had ended. Bobby had earlier threatened to take the boy away from his mother if she ever tried to leave him. So when the relationship eventually ended, Bobby made sure he kept to his threat. On the day of the abduction, he left a note stating that he had taken the boy, and that was the last time the boy's mother saw her child for the next 14 years. Bobby was determined to completely remove Julian from his mother's life, so he moved to Cleveland. There, he created new identities for himself and Julian. Bobby changed his name to Jonathan Mangina and used the name to obtain a driver's license and a social security card. Bobby raised Julian alone for the next 14 years. During this time, he fed his son lies about how his mother didn't love him and had abandoned him, whereas she had spent years looking for him. Unfortunately, Julian believed the lies his father fed him and was forced to go through nearly 2 decades of his life believing that his mother hated him. If Richard hadn't been found, he too would have spent his early teens believing whatever lies his mother planned to feed him. Bobby Hernandez's decade-long deception was uncovered when 18-year-old Julian started the college application process. The process helped point out Julian's fake social security number forged by Bobby. A school counselor later discovered that Julian was on the list of missing children that had been put together by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Julian's grandmother perceived Bobby as an angry, controlling, and vengeful man who abducted his son because he wanted to get back at Julian's mother for ending their relationship. Although Julian was distraught when he uncovered his father's lies, he was able to forgive him. Julian stated that his father was the most important person in his life and had been his major source of encouragement throughout high school. Bobby might have been a vengeful man who was cold enough to separate a mother from her son for years, but Julian was lucky that Bobby worked hard to provide for him and treat him right. Another case of a parent abducting their child caused by divorce is that of Dennis Burns, whose 2 daughters were abducted by their mother in 2010. Dennis and his wife Anna Alianelli were once happily married, but their marriage ended in a divorce and a custody battle that lasted for over a year. Alianelli was divorcing her husband because he allegedly abused her during their 5 years of marriage. During the custody battle, Alianelli requested to relocate her children to Argentina because she's a native of the country, but her her request was rejected. The presiding judge found no evidence that Burns was an abuser, so he was given custody of his children who were supposed to remain in the United States. Alianelli didn't take this news well, as 3 weeks after the ruling, she took the two girls, 4-year-old Victoria and 2-year-old Sofia, and relocated to Argentina. A judge ordered Alianelli to return the children, but she never adhered. The situation soon turned into a case of international parental abduction and could only be resolved legally. But in the time before the case would be solved, Burns was able to see his daughters, although he had to travel to Argentina every time he wanted to see them. For legal purposes, he made sure to always go with a witness to make sure he wouldn't be accused of anything during the visits. Although the case had become a serious situation, Burns vowed to not give up until he was reunited with his girls. The battle for the children was taken to court, but the case was moved from one court to another because Alianelli and her lawyers were also determined to win the case. After 4.5 years of legal battle, the Supreme Court of Argentina rejected Alianelli's appeals. Burns was finally reunited with Victoria and Sofia, who were now 8 and 6 years old, in April 2015. By that time, Sofia's English was poor, so it was a bit difficult for her to communicate with her father, but Burns was overjoyed to have his daughters back. Alianelli had no choice but to return to the United States to be closer to her children, and upon her return, she was only granted supervised visitation until a judge decided how the couple would share custody of the girls. Sadly, there is an increase in the rate of divorce-related abductions in the United States. Records show that every year the State Department receives about 1,200 new cases of international abductions. The children caught in these situations often go through psychological traumas that affect them throughout their life. Sentencing. Considering the thousands of child abduction cases that exist, it is safe to say that divorce or separation not only affects the children, but it also has a way of bringing out the worst in parents. Although Richard Chekevdia was lucky enough to have been found before he suffered any permanent damage, many other parents have gone to extreme lengths and inflicted lifelong trauma on their children. It is easy to understand that a parent would do their best to fight for their child. However, some parents turn into monsters and willingly commit horrendous crimes to keep their children. Aside from becoming monsters, these parents end up facing the law when they are eventually caught. When Shannon Wilfong was made to face the law for hiding Richard for 2 years, she insisted that she did what she did to protect her son. However, she had already committed crimes and had to face the consequences of her action regardless of her motive. Shannon was charged with felony child abduction and was held on $42,500 bond, while her mother, Diane Dobbs, was charged with aiding and abetting and was held on a $1,000 bond. Shannon eventually pleaded guilty to 5 misdemeanors, including obstructing a police officer. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail and was asked to pay $1,500 in fine. She was also put on 2 years probation. Her mother, Diane Dobbs, pleaded guilty to obstruction and was fined $1,000. Another party involved in the case was Dobbs's boyfriend, Robert Sandifer, who was accused of playing a part in hiding the boy, but the charges against Sandifer were eventually dropped. After serving their punishment, Shannon and Chekevdia moved on to custody hearings that lasted for months. During the hearings, Shannon had several emotional outbursts, possibly because she knew she would lose custody of her son. The trial also produced testimonies that Shannon allowed Richard out of the house, but only at night, in a corner of the compound where passerbys couldn't see him. Dobbs also confessed that Richard and Shannon didn't have to live in the crawl space full time. She stated that the two freely lived in the house, but would hide any time a visitor dropped by. Dobbs claimed that the mother and son spent nothing more than 5 minutes hiding in the crawl space in the 2 years. She also said that Richard was allowed to run around the house and that he had once helped her plant her flower garden at the back of the house. It is easy to believe that Richard was allowed to run around the house because as soon as he was found, he was happy to be running around and didn't behave like a child who had been isolated for years. After months of custody hearings, Mike Chekevdia was given full custody of his son Richard, and Shannon was given rights to visit him. When compared to the punishment that has been meted out to other child abductors over the years, some might say that Shannon was given a much lighter sentence. For the Fritzl case, the trial began with Josef Fritzl pleading guilty to all charges except the charges of murder and grievous assault. His defense lawyer appealed to the jury to judge the case objectively and not emotionally. He claimed Fritzl wasn't entirely a devil because he made sure to take a Christmas tree down to his daughter and her children during the festive season. No matter how he tried to put it, a Christmas tree could never be equated to the level of pain Fritzl inflicted on his captives. As part of the trial, the jury watched 11 hours worth of video footage where Elizabeth testified against her father to the police and psychologists. Her testimony was so heartbreaking that the jurors could not watch watched the video for more than 2 hours at a go. Elizabeth's children, as well as mother Rosemary, all refused to testify against Fritzl, but Elizabeth's brother Harold testified and spoke of his father's physical abuse. Elizabeth never wanted to see her father again, but she decided to attend the trial in disguise. No one else recognized her, but Fritzl did, and seeing her in court broke him down. The next day after seeing her in court, Fritzl changed his pleas to guilty on all charges. Something about seeing his daughter outside of his homemade confinement had changed his mind. Fritzl was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 15 years. In contrast to the reputation he had gotten in the media, Fritzl seemed repentant when he accepted the sentence and promised not to appeal it. In the end, Josef Fritzl got the punishment he deserved, but he had already affected the lives of his daughter and her children. The children raised by Joseph and Rosemary found it hard to believe that Elizabeth was their mother and that they had other siblings. On the other hand, the children who grew up with Elizabeth had to undergo a series of therapy sessions and rehabilitation exercises to heal from all the trauma caused by living in confinement for most of their lives. It took a while, but Elizabeth and her children slowly began to normalize and understand one another. She and her children have attended summer camp and gone on trips where they learned to swim. Seeing how the case gained massive attention in the media, Elizabeth and her children had to be heavily guarded against paparazzi during their trips. Although they have significantly reintegrated into society, their lives have forever been badly affected by the actions of their father, Josef Fritzl. Another case that proves the lightness of Shannon's punishment is the Sheffield incest case. The unrepentant and incestuous father was sentenced to 25 concurrent life sentences and with a minimum of 14.5 years in prison. He was originally sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 19 years and 6 months. However, the sentence was overturned due to an appeal that considered the ruling excessive. While speaking up about what they endured, Mr. X's daughters revealed that they had made various efforts to break free from their father, but it all went to waste as he was a firm dictator. First, they tried to pay him a huge sum of money for him to stop raping them, but after collecting the sum of £100 a month from them, their wicked father did not have a change of heart. In another attempt to escape his evil claws, the women gave their father whiskey in hopes that he would drink himself to death, but that also did not work. They made one last effort to gain freedom from their father by calling Childline, but after explaining their situation, the organization could not promise that they would not separate them from their children. Hence, the girls chose to remain with their children and continue enduring their father. Thankfully, the two women were able to form relationships with men who gave them the courage to report their father. They admitted that although their father had been imprisoned and could never harm them again, they had suffered so much that would haunt them for years. The judge who presided over the case stated that it was difficult to imagine a case worse than the Sheffield case. He said he had not witnessed anything like it in the 40 years he had practiced criminal law. Josef, Fritzl, and Mr. X received much heavier sentences, and this stems from the fact that their crimes were significantly more heinous than what Shannon, Ricky's mother, did. As with many other crimes, punishment in child abduction cases is meted out based on the gravity of the crimes and the laws broken in the process. Child abductor Bobby Hernandez also got his fair share of punishment for abducting his son for 14 years. He was indicted in 2015 on 6 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of interference with custody, 1 count of forgery, 5 counts of 5th-degree felony forgery, 5 counts of first-degree misdemeanor forgery, and 11 counts of tampering with records. He was charged with tampering and felony due to the records he falsified, which included Julian's birth certificate and his own driver's license. Bobby pleaded guilty to 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of interference with custody, 1 count of forgery, and 10 counts of tampering with records. He eventually was given a 4-year sentence for his crimes. During the trial, Julian appealed to the judge not to send his father to prison. He stated that he knew all his father's lies and crimes, but had forgiven him because he loved him. He told the judge that sending his father to jail would only hurt him the same way his mother's absence hurt him. But despite his son's plea, Bobby had committed crimes that he needed to face punishment for, so his 4-year sentence was upheld. His actions not only affected Julian, they also affected Julian's mother. She stated that she left Julian's room the same for all those years because she hoped one day he would return to her. Even in his absence, Bobby had left a strong impression on Julian's mother, and so she lived her life in constant fear that he would resurface to take her other child from her. She became overprotective and would keep all her doors locked even in the middle of the day. Julian was reunited with his mother, but the years of being apart from each other means it will be a while before a bond can be formed between them. Luckily, Mike Chekevdia and his son could easily get back on track in their relationship, as their time apart was nothing compared to that of Julian and his mother. Regardless of how little or how time is spent apart, child abductions will always have some form of physical and psychological effects on the children as well as the parents. Richard Chekevdia was saved from his mother's claws early enough before any serious damage was done to him, but Shannon Wilfong is not the only parent who has done unfathomable harm to their offspring. Check out this next video to learn more about children who have suffered terrible fates at the hands of their own parents.